It's naked time again for some reason. Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Naked Now, which is episode 2 of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, one episode at a time. In this video, I will cover the episode The Naked Now. So in this episode is the episode of Next Generation where the Enterprise D encounters a ship where everyone appeared to kill themselves because they were intoxicated. And then apparently it is a disease that is brought on board the Enterprise, and the Enterprise crew start acting crazily wild, and they put the ship in danger because Wesley seizes engineering and they disable the engine so they're unable to escape this crazy destroying planet or whatever that's about to destroy them. So they have to pull together during this crazy disease that makes them all drunk in order to save the day. So I'm back. I missed you, green screen. It's been so long since I've seen this green screen. So I've been covering, of course, the original series one episode at a time, and I've had like a month-long break after finishing the original series because I, was releasing some animated series episodes, and then I did some revisited for the movies, which I had already done reviews for, and of course I've already done a review for Encounter at Farpoint, so I was doing a revisited, and I don't use the green screen for my revisited, so it's been a while since I recorded one of these reviews, and of course this is the first time I'm now going to be covering The Next Generation. It feels strange not having to talk about Kirk and William Shatner's overacting anymore. Instead, I'm going to be talking about horribly written scripts and a lot of turmoil behind the scenes and how Gene Roddenberry isn't actually that good of a showrunner. So, The Naked Now is kind of a prime example of that. Now, I've talked about in my coverage of the original series and of my revisits of the movie about how Gene Roddenberry was infamous for taking scripts, rewriting them, and changing them, which is exactly what happened here. Now, he pretty much assembled, in order for this new Star Trek show, he assembled a lot of the same old writers they used during the original series. Most notably, this episode was written by DC Fontana, but as Roddenberry's ought to do, he took the script, completely altered it, and changed it to the point where she removed her name from it and used a pseudonym because, to quote her, not quoting her, to paraphrase her, I should say, Roddenberry just added a bunch of sex to it and made it degrading towards women, and she didn't want her name attached to it. Now, of course, The Naked Now, and a lot of people, and I've watched a lot of reviews, and a lot of people question how smart it was to have the second episode of this new Star Trek show that is being criticized, and people are like, well, there's no Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, what the hell is this? And so it's trying to prove itself, it's trying to pave its own path, it's trying to be its own show. In the very second episode, you just redo an episode of the original series, and a lot of people speak up and say that's maybe not the best way to go about it. And I agree. Now, to be fair, when I first watched this episode was when I was first getting into Star Trek in the early 90s. My through was the original series because I watched the original series movies, which is what got me into Star Trek. Then I started going back and watching the original series show. Wasn't really interested in watching Next Generation, but this episode was interesting to me because, hey, it's the one with Sulu running around with the sword. I'll watch a different version of it. So I actually can understand kind of the logic, especially this being early and them wanting to appeal to those original series fans who maybe were very skeptical about Next Gen, and maybe they would have been more skeptical of Next Gen tried to be more original, more go its own way, and the show was trying to reassure them that this is Star Trek. And in fact, some people pointed out that Roddenberry put the line of Picard looking up Kirk, oh, the Constitution class Enterprise, was a direct way to make it very clear from the beginning that this is set in the same universe, that this isn't just another Star Trek-like show, that they're acknowledging the events of Kirk, Spock, McCoy that you all saw and loved actually happened in the history of this show. Which, nowadays it seems really, elementary, of course, obviously. But at this stage, that wouldn't be so evident for people. And so I get that. I get trying to make that very clear, that this is set in the same universe. And I get the appeal to try to appeal to original series fans, to try to hook them in with something they're familiar with, but with characters they're not. So I understand that, actually. But that being said, this failed miserably. It was just a terrible, worse version of The Naked Time. The Naked Time is way better than this. The Naked Time was it was funny, it was suspenseful, it was emotional, it had some good character beats. This was just silly and annoying and featured and kind of degrading, as DC Fontana pointed out. And I think the worst things about this episode... Sorry, I gotta go get my cat. She's whining. Right, so where was I? So the worst thing about this episode is the stuff that DC Fontana was talking about how Gene Roddenberry changed the script to make it so they were all horny, and particularly how the women were all horny, and they immediately just wanted to jump the bones of all the men involved. In fact, yeah, it was more the women that were horny rather than the men. And so I could see how she would find the script degrading, and this gets into whole Gene Roddenberry's obsession with sex and sexualizing Star Trek, which, if you're familiar with the channel Jessie Gender, she did several videos that were hours long that really dove into this topic. And particularly how people were complaining about Lower Decks, which is what I referenced in my intro, how that people were complaining, oh, this is disgusting, this is sexualizing Star Trek. And you're like, if you know anything about Star Trek, if you know anything about Roddenberry, you're like, but that's in its core. That's what the creator of the whole show tried to do repeatedly over and over again. And this isn't, of course, the last time we're going to bring it up in Next Generation, particularly Season 1, when Roddenberry was most heavily involved with the show. So, yeah, and also, not only does it have... Tasha Yar just having sex with multiple men, as Counselor Troy trying to jump Riker's bones, but of course he's the better man, and it has Crusher trying to fight off her apparently overwhelming urge to have sex with Jean-Luc, and he of course also tries to fight off that urge. And this is actually, so I want to pause to talk a bit about Jean-Luc and Beverly Crusher, because their romance was sort of hinted at in Season 1 and then dropped almost entirely. It was touched on through various episodes throughout the show, like in the episode Allegiance in Season 3, but it wasn't really, for the most part, it was ignored, and it wasn't really brought up again until the Season 7 episode Attached, and then the season finale, All Good Things, where there was a future where Picard and Crusher were married and then got divorced. And then, of course, this romance was finally brought up again, and the recent Picard Season 3, spoilers for that if you haven't seen it, where it's revealed that Picard and Beverly had an affair after the events of the movie Nemesis. In fact, they had a child, unbeknownst to Jean-Luc, has Beverly hid this from him. So, and I talked about before about how I think that the Beverly and Crusher romance was... my cat looks so comfortable here, but that's actually very uncomfortable for me. Anyway, I was like, I'm going to set her down. Anyway, so yeah, they... the romance I talked about before, how I actually thought it worked and I liked it, and I actually do wish they touched on the Beverly and Jean-Luc romance more. But this, ironically, is one of the rare episodes that actually do really get into it. And you had that scene, which, again, it's dumb, like the way, like, Beverly gets... drunk and starts flirting with him. She even this is the first episode that establishes the uniforms have a zipper, and she kind of unzips it a bit, and then as soon as Jean-Luc gets the disease, he goes, he makes this like weird noise, and I was like, what the hell is that? So even though I do like their coupling, and I wish the show did more with it, and this is one of the prime examples of what little they did with it, I don't like this scene. I totally agree with DC Fontana, and especially with how they just turned Yar into just all she wants to do is have sex, and yet none of the men have this. Not even fucking Riker, but I'll get to Riker later. But let me stick with Yar for a minute, because this also is infamous for being the show there where she has sex with Data. And this is something that they bring up a couple of times, although in the future Data will act like that they were romantically involved and that he has feelings for him and that they were a couple. But that's not the case. She just got drunk, had a one-night stand with him, and instantly regretted it, by the way. And at the end of the episode, she goes to him and says it never happened. And then the later future seasons try to retcon it to be like, or maybe Data is just delusional. I don't know. He's an android, so I don't think he should be delusional. To think that they were, romantically involved somehow. And I think it would be way more interesting that if they actually played it. Oh, she wants attention again. I think it would be more interesting if they actually played it that that they were a couple. Now, some people stated this is the only time Data had sex in canon, but we, officially, but we don't know in the episode. In theory, he did have a girlfriend. Now, obviously, we didn't see them get it on screen, but of course we wouldn't in a family-friendly show. I think it's implied that he got it on off-screen, so I would argue that this wasn't the only time. But I'll get to in theory when I get to in theory. But anyway, yes, I wish this would have been different. I wish if they were going to... And I think they didn't realize that they were going to kill Yara off and then have Data have sentimentality to her. So I get it. They didn't know. But I wish they actually made them an actual couple and rather just a drunken one-night stand. And again, they just recently referenced this in Picard Season 3. As God, this drunken one-night stand is very significant to Data. It's kind of sad, actually, in a way, if you think about it. But anyway, so that's why I wish it would have been something else. It would have been better. And again, the way they depicted just the women constantly wanting to have sex is, and how we know that Roddenberry purposely added that and changed it to the script is like, but does make me think less of it. It's like, what's your problem, dude? Like, yeah, and don't even get me started about it. This is the same guy who wrote Turnabout Intruder. I'm not saying, I'm just saying. But anyway, so, speaking of Data, it's utterly and totally ridiculous that he gets the virus. In fact, every future episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, he's impervious to any viruses or anything that affect human beings, as he should be. Is this a bit of plot contrivance in this episode? And god damn, is it horrible. And then there's Riker, So this is something I've railed about a lot on my channel, so I feel like I'm kind of just repeating myself now. But, so Riker, Deanna Troi goes up to him and tries to jump his bones, as I mentioned, and he touches her face and gets the disease. And so Riker carries Deanna Troi up to sickbay, puts her in the bed, goes to Dr. Crusher, and the first thing he does is touch her to get her attention. Very smart, Mr. Riker. And he gives Crusher to the disease. So then Crusher goes up to, flirt with Picard and gets a bit too close and breathes on him and gives him the disease where he goes, it's so weird. And so then you got Crusher acting totally drunk. You have Picard on the ship going, acting totally drunk too. In fact, at one stage, they call Riker up to the bridge to take command for Picard because Picard is too out of it, as Worf, the little snitch, has to be like, hey, Riker, I think Picard's infected. And so Riker goes up, and Picard's just like, we should and then Riker's like, leave, get out of here. He's like, yeah, that. And yeah, so here's the problem with that. Riker is the one who infected Crusher, and Crusher's the one who infected Picard. So why is he less drunk than Picard? That makes no sense. Why is he able to take control? And then only towards the end, when they were trying to fix all the, chips or whatever, he's like, oh, no, not now. I can't afford to get this disease. But he just acts like grumpy when he gets it, as opposed to, all the women act horny, and Picard and Data act like complete idiots, like infants. And Geordi's like obsessed with sight or whatever because we got to hammer home the thing with the visor. So this is dumb. This always bothers the fuck out of me. Why they portrayed Riker as the sober one. If anyone's going to get horny from being drunk, it should be him. But of course, this episode's kind of, sexist. It is, because Riker's the one who deserves the game. And why? And if Picard's gonna act silly, shouldn't Riker act silly first? I know people could say different people, various immune systems are different, their body makeup is different, so people react differently from different diseases, and that maybe he just has a higher tolerance. But they talk about how the intoxication of this disease is like way worse, much stronger than alcohol. So there's no way that this shouldn't be completely disabling him the way it's disabling everyone else. And it's just a weird choice, story-wise, as well. I just don't... And it kind of makes Picard look like a terrible captain. I don't know. And it bothered me a lot. And then we guess we got to talk about Wesley. Now, throughout the 90s and early 2000s, there was a growing sort of movement of Star Trek fans who did not like Wesley Crusher and thought this character was terrible. And then in more recent years, it seems like he gets a lot of defenders. Maybe because Will Wheaton's such a good guy and he's done a lot of stuff since then. I guess and I think that does have a lot to do with why a lot of people turned around on Wesley. But I don't, I am able to separate the actor from the character. Just because you got a good actor who's a good guy doesn't mean the character is good, particularly as it pertains to season 1. And this is a prime example of how fucking annoying this character is. I mean, I understand he's drunk and he has the disease like everyone else, but on his spare time he creates something that lets him imitate Picard's voice so he can pretend like Picard is calling to the ship. Yeah. And then he's like, oh, I can build a tractor beam even though I'm only 15 years old. And that, of course, he's the one that saves the day at the end of the thing. So This is getting into the Mary Sue trope, which I talked about in another video where I named him the Mary Sue of Next Gen. I don't care what anyone else... And I've heard other people trying to say... And I'm not saying Gary Stu, that's bullshit. No. Mary Sue. It will keep it all simple the same. Anyway, he's the Mary Sue of Star Trek. And he is that way because episodes like this where I jokingly say he saved the universe on multiple occasions, but he never did necessarily save the universe. That's a hyperbole. He did save the Enterprise on multiple occasions, including this one, and while he was being annoying as fuck throughout the whole episode. So no, I don't care what anyone says. I hate this character. Now, granted, he wasn't as bad in later seasons. Like, he got less annoying the older he got. So by the time we get to when he left the show in season 4, he was fine. I didn't really have much of an issue with him, although he barely appeared in season 4. But even in season 3, when he appeared a bit more, he was fine. So, although then these reappearances are... The results vary on his reappearances, let's just say that. I think there's 2 bad, 1 good, if I know. But anyway, I mean, you could probably figure out which one I'm talking about. But anyway, yeah, so I'm not looking forward to that in season 1, seeing how annoying this character is, because season 1 is definitely the worst, but season 1 is definitely the worst as a statement that could apply to most things about Next Generation. Anyway... So, yeah, covered Wesley, I covered Data, I covered Riker, covered Troy, covered Yar. Yeah, I think that's really all. There's not much more to say about this episode. It's unoriginal, it's uninspired. I don't mind them redoing, like I said, especially to draw in fans of the original series. I actually think it's a good idea, but they need to handle it better. If this episode, because I've heard a lot of people say, well, it doesn't make sense to have this episode where these characters are drunk and they act out of character because it's the second episode, so people don't even know what their characters are. But bear in mind, the naked time was shown very early on in the original series. It was episode 9 or 10, I believe, in production. I think in air date it was around the same. So I would argue, and especially characters like Sulu and Uhura and whatnot barely appeared in those early episodes. So I would argue the audience of the original series were also not incredibly familiar with these characters at the time of the airing of Naked Time. So I disagree with that, and I don't think that's what the problem with this episode is. I think the problem is that the script is terrible, and if they did actually had a good script, which I'm sure DC Fontana, her original script actually was good until Roddenberry got his grubby little hands on it, then the episode actually, still wouldn't be one of my favorites. I wouldn't call out and be like, oh, this is one of the best. It definitely would never be as good as The Naked Time, just by default of the fact that it's just copying it and doing the same idea over again. But I wouldn't mind its existence because it would, as I said, it would make sense to draw in fans of the original series, which is where I differ from a lot of other people who say that this was the wrong thing to do if you're trying to differentiate yourself from the other show. But I think it's the right thing to do because people were wary about, Star Trek fans were wary about a show without Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, so you want to placate them to a little bit. But it was done in a bad way. It was the right thing, good idea, bad execution, basically. Horrible execution. Oh yeah, the other thing I did want to bring up was it does give me a new perspective watching this episode after the pandemic. Because, and I talked about this in Strange New Worlds, they had a episode in season 1, which I believe was filmed during the pandemic, where a virus, took control over the Enterprise and everyone was getting affected, and you could tell the way the pandemic sort of shaped how the writing changed because virus episodes is something that Star Trek has done repeatedly throughout all of its incarnations and has become a tired trope, but I actually like the way Strange New Worlds handled it. And especially because they did use a lot of terms that we become familiar with because of the pandemic, like they instantly institute quarantine, lockdown, they do contact tracing and stuff like that. And so when there's a virus, they handle it very smartly and do the lockdown procedures. And it was very reminiscent of what we all went through during the pandemic. Now compare that to this episode where they do absolutely jack shit. First of all, they beam aboard this ship without any protective. Even in the naked time, they were wearing those ridiculously looking rubber suits. Now, I did rail against that idiot ensign who took off his glove and actually touched something just to scratch himself, and he touched something and then touched his face. Idiot. But at least they were wearing the suits. Like Geordi was just going around no protective gear whatsoever and just touching random people and like, he gets the virus because of course he does. But that's not it. When they go back to the Enterprise, they're like, Dr. Crusher calls Picard, like, I'm confining Lieutenant LaForge to sickbay. So what does this confining to sickbay consist of? Because if you're being confined to sickbay, that to me, that brings up images of restraints, of security guards making sure he doesn't leave, of locked doors. But we got none of that. Instead, he was just lying there free to just walk out when Dr. Crusher had her back turned, wasn't paying attention. He just roamed around the ship freely and was able to spread the disease. Again, this is a very stark contrast to how it was handled in the Strange New Worlds, where they immediately did quarantine, they immediately did lockdown, they immediately did contact tracing. We're here, they're like, we're confining him, but we're not going to restrain him or let him try to stop him from leaving sickbay in any way, shape, or form. So he does, and he goes infect everyone, and then once everyone starts to get infected, again, everyone's careless. I already talked about Riker, how he touched someone who was infected, and the first thing he does is go to Crusher and fucking touch her face. Hey, just to get her attention. And it's like, what kind of moron is he? Now, granted, maybe I'm being a bit harsher on him now because of after what we experienced after the pandemic. But even before the pandemic, I think, is very apparent that they're being extremely careless. There's no attempt made to quarantine the infected. There's no attempt to stop the spread of the disease. And of course, it quickly spreads through the ship. And everyone except for Worf apparently seems to be the only one who doesn't get infected, because they suck at trying to contain a clearly contagious and a highly destructive virus. Anyway, I just had to rant about that for a bit. So, now, again, another thing I miss doing. It's been such a long time. Gonna read some Patreon comments on this episode. So, those who support the channel, I am very thankful for. Really helps my channel. So I'll just give a quick shout out to those who support me. We have Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Medijester, Joel Lavals, Alessandro Miguelasio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very much for your support. Now, a few comments on this episode from the patrons. First comment is from Ricky that says, "Hooray! We are finally on TNG reviews, and not most of these season 1 and 2 episodes will be extremely negative, but this episode to me is completely horrible. I mean, really, they're basing this off a classic TOS episode, which was done so much better. First of all, the premiere is the same, the premise is the same, and the biggest, dumbest, and annoying thing of this episode is how the hell is Riker the only person not to get infected from the virus, and how the hell did Data and Android get infected and started acting all drunk and horny. Another thing is, it seems that the virus is basically turning the crew into sex-crazed maniacs, which is dumb. Also, this is one of the many, many cases in which Wesley Crusher saves the friggin' ship, even though he himself is affected by the virus. This episode to me has no redeeming factors whatsoever. In fact, typically I skip this episode on the rewatch, but for writing these reviews, I also revisit them to write my opinions on it, and my god, it wasn't a good experience. Be prepared to see many more negative ratings for a while until we get to season 3, which I believe the show really found its footing and became one of the greatest shows of all time. Oh, my rating is a 1 out of 10, but this isn't the worst episode of season 1, but it's one of the worst. Yeah, I can't wait to get to season 3 as well. I'm just going to power through these first 2 seasons, but I'm to really have my eye on that horizon of getting to season 3. But anyway, even season 2 is probably going to be an upgrade from season 1. Anyway, next comment is from Maddie Jester that says, "It's naked time." But thankfully, acting captain Wesley Crusher can save the day. Lovely, not the worst episode I've seen, but season 1 doesn't have many winners, and this ain't one of them. Some memorable scenes that will be remembered later, such as Data and Yar's hookup. When this episode gets mentioned in retrospect, they usually show a clip of that, but I can't get on board with a lot of silliness in this episode. It's a shame also that engineer McDougal didn't stick around for very long. I thought she was a decent character. Oh well. 4 isolinear chips out of 10 from me. Yeah, that's another thing weird about season 1, how every episode they had a different guest star to be the chief engineer. It's like the chief engineer of the week. I know there's a couple who appeared in a couple episodes, but really there was a rotating thing, which was so weird. I'm glad they fixed that in season 2. Anyway, last comment is from Brandon Nealhouse. The naked now, or if it isn't broke, don't try to fix it. The episode that pays homage to was generally moving and creepy in places. This was just a travesty. No one wears protective clothing. Geordi is left unguarded and unrestrained in sickbay. The virus makes all the women horny, and watch out for Wesley's science experiments. The chief engineer of this episode is named Sarah McDougal. I'm giving this an extra point for Ron Jones's music. This is one of the few episodes where Troy refers to Riker as Bill. I think I'd rather listen to Kevin Riley singing than watch this episode again. 4 wild parties out of 10. I think this is the only time Troy refers to Riker as Bill. I think that's it. Like, from now on, it would be Will. So this is something they kind of retconned. But yeah, because it always seemed weird, like not just now, before even when I was a teenager watching it, this is weird to hear her call him Bill. Ron Jones' music, I think, is overrated. And if you're familiar with the other channel, Lore Runner talked about how much he loved Ron Jones' music and hated Dennis McCarthy's music. I prefer Dennis McCarthy's music. Although, in season 1, Dennis McCarthy's music wasn't all that good either. Still has that cheesy sound. But not to say I don't like some of Ron Jones' score is good, to be fair, but I prefer Dennis McCarthy. I think I'll get to more of that in season 4. Although I think I've already talked about the relevant episodes. Anyway, my rating for The Naked Now out of 10 is going to be a 3. Very poor. So I'm a bit lower than Brandon and Matty Jester, but not as low as Ricky. I do take some enjoyment out of it. It is a bit silly, and I don't know. It's not the worst episode for me to watch. Like I don't think it's. There's some redeeming qualities. There's some character moments that I like, and kind of like the Picard Crusher thing, even if it was handled badly. But yeah, it's just a ripoff of Naked Time, which in itself isn't necessarily a terrible thing, but it's just handled so poorly. They just make all the women horny and all the men idiots, and Wesley Crusher saves the ship and Data gets drunk. Anyway, so yeah, that's my rating for The Naked Now. So that is it for my review of The Naked. Well, not quite it, because I did want to mention that Lower Decks parody of The Naked Time is actually more parodying this episode than The Naked Time, which I talked about, because all the characters got really horny and naked, and they took that to a greater extreme. But I would argue it was totally in the spirit. If Roddenberry could get away with showing a bunch of naked people making out and having sex in a bar or whatever, then he would have, but he couldn't. And a syndicated TV show in the 1980s. But if he could, he would. Anyway, that is it. What? You want to say goodbye? You want to say goodbye to everybody? Say goodbye. No, actually, I already fed her, so I don't know what she wants. Maybe just attention. Anyway, that is it for my review of The Naked Now. I shall be back. More Next Generation. This is only the beginning. We'll be covering Next Generation, which I'm so looking forward to that. So let me find where we're at here. Thursday, of course, is going to be reviewing Strange New Worlds, new episode. Saturday, I'll be back with an even better episode, in the quotations, Code of Honor. Actually worse episode, you know what I mean. And then Monday, the fun continues with The Last Outpost. And then Thursday, another Strange New Worlds. And then next Saturday, actually finally get to a decent episode with Where No One Has Gone Before. So, that's what's coming up on the channel. Be sure to check out my channel. Subscribe if you haven't already. And thanks so much for watching.